يسعد مساكم جميعا واهلا وسهلا في الجميع المشاركين معنا اليوم في الانطلاقه. قبل بحب انوه بالنسبه لموضوع الترجمه، في عندنا الترجمه الانجليزي العربي كمان. اوكي. Hello and welcome. Dears, kindly note the translation availability and 5 minutes intervention for each speaker. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, our dear members and colleagues. The Arab Campaign for Education for All is honored to welcome you all members and partner institutions to attend the launch of the 4th cycle of the Arab Educational Policies Academy on the analysis of public budgets for education this evening. Pleased to welcome you all. As part of the basic strategies of the Arab Educational Policies Academy, which integrates training and capacity building on the one hand, review and analysis of policies on the other hand, the Arab Campaign for Education for All is holding today the 4th edition of the Academy under the title Analysis of Public Budgets for Education. The Academy will be organized over 3 consecutive days, 3 days in a row via Zoom platform. This year, the topic analysis of public budgets for education will be the main theme of the Academy. Important and interesting titles will be presented under this topic, analysis of public budgets that needs free and open intellectual discussion, in addition to bringing up many Arab and international experiences and models in this field, with the participation of a group of Arab and foreign experts and educators as well. Over 2 years, the Academy has hosted more than 200 participants from various Arab countries and was able to start the step in the journey of 1,000 miles in order to influence education policies in a region that has conflicts and wars. The latest was COVID-19. I would like to emphasize that the Academy of Arab Educational Policies is a qualitative addition to the work of the Arab Campaign for Education for All at the regional and national levels. And we hope through it to provide the Arab educational movement with a new Arab expertise capable of paving the way for the future. This year, more than 50 participants from various Arab countries will participate with us, from experienced civil society activists, researchers, and academics, who gathered in order to gain knowledge and exchange expertise and experiences in order to make a change in the reality of education financing in our region and to make education a priority for governments. Before we begin this webinar, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you who sincerely committed to this event to make it a success. This event would have been impossible without the support of each and everyone present here. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. My regards to all our members joining us too. Kindly note the translation availability and 5 minutes intervention for each speaker. The launch will include presentation of the Academy's programs in details, ice-breaking also between the participants and discussions. Please note that after we finish the opening, our 4th cycle Academy members will move to another platform with a new link will be provided to the registered members via the WhatsApp group to continue with the head of the advocacy unit, Mr. Mu'tasem, and the facilitator of the Academy, Dr. Nasser Abdel Karim, for further preparations and discussions related to the agenda. Let me introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Zahi Azar, the president of the Arab Campaign for Education for All.
Hello everybody. ممكن نحكي عربي وفي ترجمة؟
طبعا.
اوكي. باسم الحملة العربية للتعليم نرحب بكم جميعا، نرحب بضيوفنا، بشركائنا، بالمشاركين في أعمال هذه الأكاديمية. ونحن سعداء جدا أن نكون مجتمعين سوية حول هذا الحدث المهم في حياة الحملة العربية للتعليم. هناك من كان دوما في التحضير لهذا اللقاء كان يسألنا دوما شو أهمية قراءة الموازنات وبالنسبة لشغلنا. الحقيقة أنه نحن في العملة العربية للتعليم نلتزم، نسير ونكتشف. شو يعني هيك؟ معناها أننا فعلا للوصول إلى أهدافنا كنا جدا مصغيين إلى كل تفاعل شبابي أو عبر الناشطين التربويين لما نقوم به في الحملة، لنكتشف شيئا فشيئا أننا توقفنا عند أهمية بناء القدرات وأهمية التمكين للنساء والرجال ليتواكبوا مع عملنا في الحملة باتجاه الأهداف وباتجاه تحقيق الهدف الرابع وباتجاه النمو في التربية وتنمية التربية في العالم العربي ككل ونقل هذه الخبرة إلى العالم. أي أننا اكتشفنا شيئا فشيئا أن الإلمام بجوانب اقتصادية أساسية ضروري للوصول إلى الأهداف التربوية، ولذلك نحن نجتمع اليوم حول قراءة الموازنات التي توضع على المستوى التربوي، لأن هذه القراءة فعلا شيء جديد يمكن كل ناشط تربوي اليوم من أن يصبح أكثر قرباً مما يدور من سياسات في المجتمع، أي عبر الإلمام وعبر التعلم الاقتصادي يصبح أقرب إلى فهم السياسات التربوية والفعل في السياسات التربوية وتحقيق أهداف الحملة ككل. كما تعرفون كل اقتصاد، كل العالم الاقتصاد كان مهمشا في العملية التربوية، مهمشا، واعتاد الناس على أنها تخصصات. هناك من يتخصص في الاقتصاد ومن يتخصص في التربية، لنكتشف اليوم من جديد أن لهذه التخصصات حدود، وأننا إن لم نكن ملمين بالأوجه الاقتصادية الأساسية ليس فقط في التربية إنما في المجتمع، لا يمكننا أن نكون مؤثرين وفاعلين في التربية. نقطة أخرى هي الأهلية، الإلمام بالاقتصاديات هذه التي نعيشها كأساسيات في التربية يسهل لنا الحوار مع الدولة، يسهل هذا الحوار بين العاملين التربويين والممسكين بالقرار في الدولة، بعد أن كان هذا الحوار مفقودا لمدة طويلة. وهذا هو الجديد الذي نسعى به ونصبو إليه اليوم. النقطة الأخيرة تتعلق بين الناشطين التربويين، إلمامهم بالاقتصاد وفعلهم في المجتمع المدني ككل. نتكلم عن المجتمع العربي المدني الذي هو أيضا ككل ما زال مهمشا ويسعى إلى الخروج من عزلته ومن تهميشه، وهذا أيضا ينطبق ضمن هذه المسيرة التي تقوم بها الحملة العربية للتعليم. كلها مكتشفات نسعى إلى ترجمتها عبر هذه الأكاديمية، عبر بناء هذه القدرات، عبر التمكين، لنقول في النهاية أن هذا التلاقي بين التمكين الاقتصادي إذا جاز التعبير والتمكين التربوي أساسي في مسيرتنا في الحملة عبر مختلف الائتلافات، عبر مختلف البلاد، وكذلك ننسج جديدا على المستوى العربي. نأمل عبر الحملة أن ننقله أيضا إلى المستوى العالمي تدريجيا بعد أن تنضج هذه الخبرة. شكرا لكم، شكرا لاستماعكم. أتمنى أن ننطلق في أعمالنا وأن يكون هذا اللقاء مثمرا وقابلا للتشارك مع العدد الأكبر من العاملين التربويين. شكرا لحضوركم.
Thank you, Dr. Zahi.
Thank you.
Let me introduce to you our second speaker, Mr. Tanbir Muntasem from GPE. Tanbir Muntasem is a specialist in civil society and mutual accountability at the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, which is the largest global fund dedicated to transforming education. He currently manages Education Out Loud, the largest civil society education advocacy fund in the world. He provides technical advice to support stronger engagement of CSOs, teachers, organizations, and other national stakeholders in education sector policy, monitoring and management processes. Please allow me to welcome Mr. Tanbir.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, if you can hear me?
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank Arab Campaign for Education for All for inviting us to be part of this wonderful initiative, and congratulate them on selecting such a very timely topic as part of the Academy. I mean, as a multi-stakeholder partnership, Global Partnership for Education looks at budget as one of the key accountability tools for the government and the relationship between the citizen and the state, and supports participation of civil society in the processes. Because without civil society participation, a democratic budget cannot be designed, implemented, and monitored. We are also very conscious about the current time when we have seen the right to participation decline over the years. So if you remember that the Freedom House Index reminds us that the global freedom has declined for the 15th consecutive year. And Civicus Index also tells us that 87% of the citizens of the world live in countries which are considered repressed or obstructed in terms of participation, and only 3.7% citizens live in countries which can be considered open societies for participation. And we have also seen the situation worsen during the COVID pandemic, where participation of civil society in national processes and democratic spaces have been limited. We have seen education for especially marginalized groups and in conflict affected countries decline. From GP, we have tried to support different governments and countries to continue education without with minimal disruption, but it has always been a uphill battle for all of us, and we have always been very conscious that we really need a strong civil society to participate in continuing this effort. If we look at the numbers, and I'm sure that over the next couple of days, you will look at the numbers from the economics point of view, but also a sociological and anthropological point of view, that how these numbers interpret in budgets and what are the broader connotation politically, socially, economically, inside the classroom and outside the classroom in terms of ensuring education for the marginalized groups. So numbers tell us very different stories. If you look at the numbers for the education development assistance in the Middle East and North Africa region, you will see that the numbers have gone up in terms of aid to basic education between 2009 to 2019. But if we look beyond that, we also have to understand that the support to education is only 2.4% of support that goes in terms of emergency response. And most of the support that has gone in this region has been from the point of view of emergency response and not always from a longer term development aspect of education. So all these numbers will come into play as we move forward in terms of understanding about budgets, in terms of the importance of participation of civil society in defending the space for education support as we move forward and we see increased conflict and struggle across the world. And the recent struggle in Ukraine is a reminder of that, how we can see different challenges affect and impact civil liberties and participation in education as well, and how it affects the overall situation. From GP through Education Out Loud, we work with many of you, and we are very pleased to see this effort. And we have really seen concrete impact of civil society participation in education advocacy and using budget as an entry point. And we look forward to supporting these initiatives as we move forward. And we would like to congratulate this group of participants, and we pin a lot of hope on these participants that they will act as champions of civil society as budgets are designed, formulated, implemented, and monitored in the different countries. And from Global Partnership for Education, we express our full commitment to stand beside you in this work as a civil society to ensure there is social and public accountability in countries. So thank you for this opportunity, and we look forward to learning more and working closely with you as we move forward. Thanks to Arab Campaign for Education for All and all the participants for being part of this initiative, and wishing you all the best as you move forward to this cycle of Education Academy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Danvir. Thank you. Now let's move to our third intervention and introduce to you Mr. Werner. Mr. Werner Munoz has worked for over 30 years in human rights, combining his duties in the governmental sector and non-government organizations with his career as a university professor. He is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education for the period 2004 till 2010, and the Global Campaign for Education's Head of Policy Advocacy and Campaigns. Please allow me to welcome Mr. Werner.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Werner.
Thank you. Greetings from the Global Campaign for Education Secretariat. The Global Campaign for Education is very happy to join this event, and we express our gratitude to Kia and congratulate you for the launch of the Academy. Education is first universal human right. It should be guaranteed to all people in all cases, including emergencies. So the Global Campaign for Education also reaffirms its conviction that all people have the right to self-determination. So the GC rejects the Russian occupation of Ukraine. In the same way, we reject the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestine. The COVID-19 outbreak is affecting girls and boys and women and men differently. And the pandemic impact on education was huge, not only in terms of the number of schools closings, but in terms of the terrible effect on those who live in rural areas, people with disability, those who lack of electricity, electronic devices, and internet access. The COVID-19 pandemic has put the entire sustainable development agenda at risk, in particular the right to education, affecting around 1.5 billion learners in almost 200 countries where schools have closed and learning disrupted. However, please notice that the pandemic just revealed the exclusion and discrimination that was there before COVID-19. Most of current education problems come from outside the education systems, and that is why the term education crisis is relative. Education financing and in general public financing is part of this concern. While the international law states that governments should take steps to the maximum of their available resources to realize the right to education, the international political frameworks are more precise around their obligations on education financing. For instance, the Incheon Declaration, aligned to the Sustainable Development Agenda, states that all countries should allocate efficiently at least 4 to 6% of gross domestic product and at least 15 to 20% of the total public expenditure to education. And obviously, these instruments also state that the official development assistance by rich countries should achieve the target of 0.7% of gross national product for developing countries. So despite these clear obligations, according to UNESCO, the total annual financing gap is around $39 billion. Now, it's well known that 97% of the new financing needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal on education will need to come from domestic resources. So the international cooperation should prioritize their aid to fragile and low-income countries. And at the same time, international financing mechanisms should not lend to countries at moderate or high risk or debt distress, especially during the pandemic. And obviously banks should not be empowered to doing business at the cost of the sanitary emergencies. Now, regarding the private sector, I think that private sector should contribute building an enabling environment, no doubt about it. But private sector should not lead the education governance, which is clearly a state central obligation. The participation of big corporates in national and international policy spaces on education should depend on companies having a reputation for solidarity, transparency, and reciprocity. And paying fair taxes where they make profits is perhaps the most critical indicator of this. We should stress that the crisis in education financing arises in part from the aggressive tax avoidance by the richest companies that have left public budgets stripped of resources to fund quality public education. Now, concerning the pathways to influence to mobilize education and action towards bold financing solutions for the realization of right to education, I would like to quickly suggest some urgent recommendations. In first place, states and international community must ensure the continuity of learning for all persons, including those who are most disadvantaged and likely to be excluded. Distance and virtual education is an option only if people has access to technology. So closing the digital and technological gap should be a priority. Set progressive national budgeting, including the continued payment and incentives of teachers and school staffs, seems to be urgent as well. International community should consider debt cancellation and debt relief to unlock funds in developing countries' budgets and ensuring that the provision of additional finance does not put countries in higher risk of debt distress. And finally, I think that these difficult times offers a unique opportunity for all to review the current privatization and utilitarian trends of education and strengthen the public education systems. So education remains as an enabling right, not only responding to employers' needs, but to the development of the respect of human dignity and the human rights of education. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Werner. Thank you for this intervention, Werner. And now let's welcome and listen to Mr. David Archer, but before allow me to introduce him. Mr. David Archer from ActionAid International he's the head of, Mr. David Archer is the head of economic justice and public services with ActionAid International. He's the chair of the Right to Education Initiative and was a co-founder of the Global Campaign for Education in 1999. Let's listen to Mr. David.
Thank you very much, Hiba, and thank you very much to Asaya. I'm delighted to be with you and a lovely gathering of people here. If we're going to focus on the analysis of public budgets for education, I think one of the most useful frameworks to use is the 4S framework, which was developed between ActionAid, Education International, and the Global Campaign for Education, and talks about the need to look at 4 S's: the share of the budget dedicated to education, the size of the budget overall, the sensitivity of the allocation of that budget, and the scrutiny of the budget in practice. I will recognize that in translating that into Arabic, there will be some challenges with the 4 S's, but I hope they do make some sense. I think the share of the budget tends to be the thing which most people focus on, and we've got this recognized benchmark that government should be spending 20% of their national budgets on education, and if countries are spending less than that, there should be a lot of pressure to increase to get the budget to at least 20% of national expenditure dedicated to education. Lower income countries are more likely to need to spend over 20% of their budgets to make a difference. But the problem is that the global civil society movement, I think we've tended to focus too much on the share of the budget and perhaps not looked enough at the size of the budget. Werner has touched on it just now, but it is crucially important because a 20% share of a small pie is a small amount. And as an education community, we need to get much more seriously engaged in the question of what's the size of we can just cut out that the size of the government budget overall is determined more than anything else by the tax revenue that is collected. And it can make a huge difference. Low-income countries tend to have a tax to GDP ratio of about 16%, middle-income countries nearer 25%, and high-income countries 35%. If you are only collecting a small percentage of GDP in taxes, it will be very difficult to provide universal basic services, whether in education or health or in other areas. So action to expand the tax to GDP ratio is one of the things that can make the most transformative difference to the financing of education. In fact, it is estimated that if, for example, your tax to GDP ratio was 16% and you managed to raise it by 5 percentage points to 21%, most countries could double their spending, literally double their spending on education and on health and on social protection. So the size of the tax revenue that a government collects is a hugely important factor for determining whether or not a 20% share of the budget for education will be adequate. The other critical factor in looking at the size of the budget is the macroeconomic policies that are being pursued, and particularly what is the impact that the International Monetary Fund has on ministries of finance. There is a depressing cult of austerity that is shared by the ministries of finance in many countries and the ideologues at the International Monetary Fund. This cult of austerity is one which is not based on systematic evidence or any sort of rigorous reviews. It is just an ideological position that persuades governments to constrain their public spending, often to extreme degrees. And a particularly serious time is happening now, because following COVID, where some governments spent more in order to respond to COVID, there is pressure on governments to reimpose austerity. And the estimate is that 85% of the population of the world will be living under austerity by the end of 2022. So this cult of austerity is really dangerous. And the biggest indicator of that cult, the thing which we need to be most concerned about, is the routine use of public sector wage bill constraints. So the IMF and ministries of finance see holding down the public sector wage bill as the way to avoid, to achieve the restriction that they believe is necessary. They have no evidence for this, and when they talk about constraining the public sector wage bill, the single largest group on the public sector wage bill is teachers in pretty much every country. And the second largest group of people are health workers, nurses, doctors, community health workers. So if you have got a limit on how much you can spend on your public sector wage bill, the only way to achieve that and to deliver it is to actually cut spending on teachers and health workers. So if we want to make a difference and expand spending on education, we have to engage in those strategic debates with the Ministry of Finance about the size of the budget overall and whether or not spending on public sector workforce will be allowed. Because teachers, professional teachers, are the single largest item on every education budget. So if you can't spend more on teachers, you struggle to spend more on education in general. So we have to look at a fair 20% share at least of a good sized budget, expanded with progressive tax reforms, targeting the biggest, richest companies and individuals as flagged by Werner. In fact, there's a very strong case for reviewing the whole of the tax system in each country to ask ourselves, in what way can each of these taxes be made more progressive so that they that they target those who've got the most resources, and that the burden on the poorest and those who struggle to pay is reduced. But a good share of a good sized budget is not enough if it's not sensitively allocated, and particularly sensitively allocated through a lens of equity, making sure that resources arrive to benefit the most excluded groups, whether it's girls, whether it's other groups who face discrimination in society. In many cases, I think questions of racial justice become more and more important, and a lens which we need to be using routinely. But we need to look at whether the resources are reaching those who most need education, because an effective education budget, an effective analysis of the budget, will focus on the equity in the budget and whether or not spending is matching the priorities of the most excluded groups. And then the final S is the scrutiny of the budget's tracking, making sure that there's a systematic understanding of how the education budget is supposed to work, and making sure that the money arrives in practice. And that, I think, is a really crucial role for civil society. And when we are scrutinizing the education budget, we need to scrutinize the sensitivity, the share of the budget, and the size of the government budget overall. To properly understand education budgets, we need to scrutinize each of these elements. I think that there's a huge opportunity in the coming years for us to really build our capacity to do this much more systematically than has been done in the past. And I think if we as civil society movement can do this effectively, it will be a massive contribution to the achievement of education for all. The finances for education are there if the right policies are pursued. But it's not just about the policies about spending directly on education, it's about the attitude to the public sector as a whole and to the wider financing of government. So we need to get serious and look at the bigger picture than perhaps we have in the past. Thank you very much. I'll pass back to Heather, and good luck with the rest of the workshop.
Thank you, dear David. Thank you, dear David. We are glad that we have you here with us in this panel. And now let's welcome Professor Denise Senolio, and allow me to introduce him. Professor Denise. Dr. Denise is the Director of Education International's African region, which includes all the countries on the continent, as well as Lebanon, Palestine, and Yemen. Prior to this role, he was in charge of EI's Education, Employment and Research Unit at its headquarters in Brussels. Dr. Denise sits on several boards and committees, including the Global Partnership for Education, the GPE, Education Cannot Wait, the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030, and UNESCO's International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa. He has undertaken several studies on education and teachers. Let's listen to Dr. Denise.
Thank you very much, Heba. Good evening, colleagues. It is an honor for me to join you today in this very important discussion. And thanks for inviting me and my organization. In fact, when I learned about the Arab Educational Policies Academy, I thought, oh, wow, this is a wonderful initiative. So thank you very much for coming up with the Academy and for coming up with such important discussions as we have today, analyzing public education budgets. Colleagues, this is the time for governments to invest more, not less, on education. More teachers are needed to ensure that all children are taught by a qualified teacher, and to ensure that all children learn in safe, healthy, and well-resourced classrooms and environments. As Education International, we have been working together with our member organizations, teacher unions from around the world and from your region, advocating for investment in education and for investment in teachers. We have carried out research, we've developed tools, we've organized and mobilized our members to challenge the conditionalities and the austerity policies of international financial institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank. David referred to these in his remarks. We have and will continue to put pressure on governments to guarantee the right to quality public education for all. For example, PI member organizations in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Lebanon have been challenging World Bank policies and pushing for debt cancellation. We all know about the challenges faced by our colleagues in Lebanon, the austerity measures, the economic and financial crisis. That's why debt cancellation is very, very important for a context such as Lebanon, as it would actually be one of the first significant steps towards recovery and financing quality education in the country. David has clearly spoken to the 4S framework, but if you may allow me to add additional comments looking at this very important framework. Concerning the share of the budget, let's remember the internationally agreed benchmarks. The 4 to 6% of GDP minimum, which should be allocated to education, or 15 to 20% of the national budget minimum, which should go to education. And Refat would remember the negotiations that happened in the lead up to 2015. It was not easy. We wanted the minimum of 6% and 20%, nothing less. The reason why these figures went down to 4 to 6 minimum, 15 to 20, is simply because it was agreed that we would have a global focus in the SDG 4, in fact, all the SDGs framework, instead of focusing on developing countries only. Therefore, many developed countries, including Japan, the UK and others, say, no, we don't need to put 20% because of the nature of our population, which is aging. So please put a range so that we can be on the lower side of the range, while developing countries are on the higher side. Why is this important? It's important because today we get countries saying, oh, we're investing 15% in education, so we're okay. I'm talking about developing countries. You are not okay. The agreement in Incheon, in Paris, was that developing countries would still have to meet the minimum benchmarks, which are 6% and 20%. Currently, globally, we know that countries, according to the Global Education Monitoring Report, are only investing 4.4%. So they are far from reaching the minimum. So let's push in our advocacy for these minimum benchmarks to be met in investing in education. The consequence of that, of course, is that we would have more resources also going to teacher training, continuous professional development, teacher salaries and support. The other important point I want to stress concerning increasing the size of the budget, the size, which is the second S, is that it's important for us to fight corruption. There are many leakages in education, in fact, in government, through corruption, for example, but also through tax holidays, through tax avoidance, through tax evasion. So these things should be tackled head on so that more resources can be invested in public services, particularly in education, as well as health, for example. It's important to also emphasize the need for inclusion, which is the sensitivity of the budget that David was talking about. Looking at COVID-19, unfortunately, many children are being left far behind, rural children, simply because during COVID-induced closures, it was not possible for many countries to deliver virtual teaching and learning. But girls are disproportionately affected. We have seen a rise in sexual abuse, we have seen a rise in child pregnancy, early marriage, child labor. So if we are going to change the situation for girls, we need to have targeted approaches of investing more in education, getting every child back to school. That's why AI is calling for what we call equity audits. What that means is that we need to carry out an assessment of who is being left behind and pull them to the front. And in this case, we're worried about the situation of girls. We're worried about the situation of children in conflict areas, for example, and those with disabilities. But let's also remember about the critical importance of investing in female teachers and creating opportunities for them actually to participate actively in education and to assume leadership positions. And finally, it's important in terms of scrutiny to track the budgets, to see where the money is going. And as civil society, we can play a critical role there through research, for example. And then I would like to leave you with this. I would like to reiterate our call for governments and development partners to invest in education and teachers. I'm just coming from a meeting with ECW, Education Cannot Wait. GPE, we have GPE here, and Education Cannot Wait, as two important funds supporting SDG4 can play a critical role in supporting governments that need more resources to complement their domestic resources. And they should certainly play that significant role. Colleagues, investing in education is investing in people. Investing in our young people is investing in our future, in the future of the world we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Denise. Thanks to you too, Dr. Denise, for accepting our invitation. It is our pleasure actually to have you in the fourth cycle in this virtual launch event of the fourth cycle of the Arab Educational Policies Academy. Now moving to the sixth intervention with Mrs. Nelsie Lizarzo from CLED. Mrs. Nelsie is the General Coordinator of the Latin American Campaign for the Right to Education, with studies in philosophy and literature, and a master's degree in political science and international relations. Educator and popular communicator, activist for nonviolence. Please allow me to welcome Mrs. Nelsie.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do my best effort to speak in English. But first, I want to thank to the Friends of ACIA for this invitation, and my congratulations for the initiative and for the topic they have chosen to address, because it's a topic that has always been on our common agendas, but which today acquires enormous relevance. Also in our region, already the most unequal on the planet, the pandemic has unveiled the problems of injustice, violence, concentration of wealth, and many others that already existed and has dramatically deepened them, as has surely happened in our sister regions. It is a very challenging moment that urge analysis and proposals. In terms of educational spending, according to recent studies by UNESCO and Itlaq, had it not been for the pandemic, in 25 countries of the region, educational spending would have increased by 3.6%. Given the economic contraction, this expenditure may not only not increase, but decrease by 9%. Recent data from Argentina show a decrease of 6.2% in the public education budget, and in Ecuador, only for public higher education, a decrease of 11.5% in the 2022 budget. Faced with data like this, we could take two paths. We agree and admit that due to the pandemic, there is less money, and therefore we accept the lower investment in public education, or we investigate and highlight other ways to have the required money. As you can imagine, CLADE takes the second option. For this reason, we have recently developed and published two investigations in this sense about tax justice and education. The study is an approach to the impact that illicit fiscal flows have on tax collection and its relationship with educational investment. It was carried out in Guatemala and Argentina and is scalable to the entire region. The study identified three specific lines of taxation to generate additional resources to invest in education. First, on the great wealth of individuals, especially the undeclared wealth. Two, on real estate property, especially undervalued property. And three, on the abuse of multinational companies and corporations. In Guatemala, this kind of tax collection would mean multiplying 4 times the educational investment that the country makes per student, and in Argentina, almost tripling it. About debt and the human right to education. This study, recently concluded and soon to be published, clearly shows how debts, both public and private, work as mechanisms that compromise the fulfillment of the human right to education, both by displacing resources in favor of debt services, compromising other allocations, and by the adaptation of debtors to the demands, explicit or not, of creditors. Countries that have made more progress on the SDG 4 targets have less budget committed to debt prepayment and vice versa. If the region had limited, not even suspended, debt repayment to 12%, investment in education could have increased by 5% in the last 5 years. The 3 Latin American countries with the greatest deterioration in the debt education ratio is in the last 5 years were Argentina, Ecuador, and Honduras. It is important to highlight that those 3 countries signed agreements with a strong condition with the IMF. And here we arrive to the last point, saying no to austerity policies. Decades of history have shown us the serious consequences of these policies, not only for public education, but also for the exercise of human rights. On the contrary, we are convinced not only that it's necessary to invest more and better, and we are demonstrating that the money exists, but it is not allocated where it should be. More budget, better invested, and with citizen control are the keys to guarantee the exercise of the human right to education, and with it, the overcoming of most of the existing inequalities. Progressive fiscal policies, debt limitation, and non-austerity are concrete and viable paths. As long as decisions are not made behind closed doors in the finance ministries, and communities and organizations actively participate in the proposal and control of educational investments. I express my wishes of success to ACIA in this new effort and reaffirms CLADE's willingness to exchange views amongst the participating institutions and public. Hopefully, these minutes have brought us a little closer to an interesting discussions, perhaps around delicious Arabian coffee. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Nancy. Thank you so much, dear Nancy. And now our intervention. And now our intervention is with the distinguished butterfly of ASPE, whom most of us know, Mrs. Helen Dabu. Mrs. Helen was appointed the Secretary General of Asia South Pacific Association for Basic and Adult Education ASPE, effective the 1st of January 2021, but has been with ASPE since 2009. Helen is a lawyer and a registered social worker in the Philippines and has been engaged in education and development work in the last 19 years. She has a track record in advocacy, capacity building, institutional building, and networking in Asia-Pacific region. She has dedicated her professional life to championing human rights. You may go ahead, dear Helen.
Thank you so much, dear Heba. Good evening, and it's still Miss, not Mrs. And to all our colleagues in the Arab region and those participating from the various parts of the world. Good evening from the Philippines. It's almost midnight in my time zone, or it's actually midnight now, 1 minute to midnight. But I could not say no to our dear friends in Akia to be with them in this very important event in the region, and to also extend our greetings of peace and warm solidarity with all of you. For my input, I've been asked to focus on the role of civil society in shaping education budget from our experience in the Asia Pacific. And while there is so much to say on this topic alone, I will just highlight how we have responded to the enormous challenge posed by the COVID-19 pandemic and other contextual issues in education financing in our region, which also echoes so much of the earlier inputs of our dear, excellent fellow panelists in this session. No, I struggled actually what else to say when the colleagues colleagues have already highlighted what I also want to say. As the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy and fiscal spending were unfolding in 2020, ASBE and our CSO members in the region persevered to make a strong case to protect education budgets and for education to form part of stimulus packages in the era of COVID. Particularly in advancing SDG 4, we as CSOs and education rights activists have been very concerned about the tendencies of governments and donors to regress or walk back on their commitments to meet the full SDG 4 targets and in upholding their duties on the right to education. The pandemic-induced threat to education extended ever deeply to its governance and financing, with low education budgets threatened further by debt and austerity responses to fiscal challenges. Education privatization and commercialization gained more ground in the era of expanded digital learning. From the onset of the pandemic and throughout 2021 and until now, we in the education movement were very quick to respond to the COVID-19 crisis at various levels, especially in defending our space in education policy mechanisms. Particularly in the Asia Pacific, ASBE and its members have ensured that the interests, voices, and perspectives of the marginalized sectors were not left behind in the COVID-19 education responses, and we strongly push governments to strengthen and widen the education responses in their stimulus packages. We have sustained our active engagements in shaping public education responses to the crisis by advancing a rights-based perspective. Now, to deepen our work, ASBE advanced country-level evidence-based advocacy for education financing by supporting 10 country case studies undertaken by national education coalitions covering the countries of Pakistan, Vietnam, Samoa, Timor-Leste, Tajikistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, Mongolia, and my country, the Philippines. This effort of ASBE in the region enabled national coalitions to deepen their analysis on the impact of COVID-19 to education financing with gender, equity, and inclusion lens. These studies aim to propose a set of actionable recommendations to guide country-level advocacy of national coalitions on how to ensure that increased and well-targeted education financing is allocated to advance gender equity and inclusion in education. These country-level researches and studies, and through these country-level researches and studies, ASBE also developed and shared research tools and methodologies to further deepen the research skills of national education coalitions in the Asia Pacific. Additionally, to advocate for greater financing for education, ASBE co-organized a virtual two-day regional conference on domestic resource mobilization and tax justice for financing of education in the Asia Pacific in October 2021 in collaboration with ActionAid International and the Tax and Education Alliance. This was well participated by ASBE members, CSOs among our region, in our region, including national education coalitions. Follow-up actions from this initiative will continue to be pursued in the region. So these are just some of the highlights of our concrete CSO efforts in the region to push for sustainable financing to strengthen public education systems. I will end by affirming that greater, better quality and sustainable education financing will remain a key advocacy of ASBE in the coming period. We will continue to reinforce the financing commitments made in the SDG 4 or Education 2030 Framework for Action. And at the same time, we will continue to challenge loan-based solutions to close the education financing gaps, including challenging debt arrangements that promote austerity measures that cap wages of teachers and education personnel. We will also continue to critique the role of private sector in public education systems and in education policy making, especially amidst the rising and accelerated role of education and digital technology companies in education delivery. Thank you, and my congratulations to our colleagues in ACIA in launching this valuable academy to strengthen education policies and financing in the Arab region.
Thank you, dear Helen. Thank you, dear Helen. Now, let me introduce you to our last speaker and intervention with our guest from ANSEFA, Mrs. Solange Akpo. Mrs. Solange is the Regional Coordinator of Africa Network Campaign on Education for All, ANSEFA, a Pan-African civil society network of national education coalitions active in 38 countries. Solange Akpo is a lawyer and human rights activist with more than 15 years experience in advocating and campaigning for the rights to education for all in Africa. You may go ahead, Mrs. Solange.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good night to you, colleagues. It is a great pleasure for me to speak on behalf of ANSEFA in this gathering. I wish to express our gratitude to the Arab Campaign for Education for All, ACEA, for launching this great initiative and associating ANSEFA to its launch. I bring you warm greetings from my colleagues in ANSEFA, the Pan-African CSO network championing the right to education with membership in some 38 countries. I want to take this opportunity again to commend our sister network for this academy, which has demonstrated its relevance in bringing a whole range of actors together, from academy, university, CSO actors on the ground, practitioners, for training and learning from policies, analysis, and exchange experiences and practices, so as to build confidence and knowledge for members to critically engage. The theme of the year, focusing on analysis of education financing, is timely, as most of the countries are struggling to recover from the COVID pandemic, which has affected all sectors, including education and the economy of our countries as a whole. The COVID attack heavily impacted the economy of countries and affected families' income. The Education Finance Watch 2021 indicates that lower income countries are more likely to continue a decreasing trend in their education budgets or to shift from a positive to a negative trend after COVID. And yet, education needs have increased with the digital education and the need to recruit more teachers, to train them and to motivate them to support and deliver quality education. As civil society activists, we are aware that adequate financing for education is paramount in achieving inclusive and equitable education for all boys and girls, men and women, and in particular, the most marginalized in our communities. We need to step up our effort to ensure that countries meet their commitment made at various spaces, including during the GP Education Financing Summit in London. And we need also to fight the austerity measures David mentioned shortly. This requires that we understand the human rights framework, the budgets, the fiscal policies, but also the role of civil society in pushing for the achievement of SDG 4. We also need to understand the role of education as an enabling factor to achieve other development goals. The 8th session of the Africa Regional Forum for Sustainable Development has opened today in Kigali and will run for the next 2 days under the theme, Building Forward Better, a green, inclusive, and resilient Africa poised to achieve the 2030 Agenda and Agenda 2063. Speakers emphasize the importance of finance, education to ensure that countries recover from the COVID. Shifting from our previous pact, we are committed to look at how resources are raised before getting into how they are allocated, used, and accounted for to achieve sustainable quality education for all. Previous speakers have spoken about the 4S, so we are committed to use the 4S for our education finance work. We also need to call upon developed countries to increase their aid to education. In countries affected by conflict, as are many of our countries, making education a priority in the nexus of humanitarian and development intervention is paramount. For all those aspects, which request sound, thoughtful, and strong CSO position, we need to build our capacities upfront. This is why the leadership of AXEA in initiating this Arab Educational Policies Academy should be saluted, scaled up, and expanded to other regions. ANSEFA stands with AXEA and other regions, and we are happy to learn from it and explore ways of collaboration. I wish you a successful 4th session. Thank you for having me with you.
Thank you, Mrs. Solange, for this last intervention.
Can you open your cameras?
رفعت فكرت بالآخر بعد ما أخلص. Okay. Please open your cameras so as to have a group photo. Please open your cameras for a group photo before I end and I close the open of this virtual online.
Werner, open your camera, Werner.
Mu'tasam, please open your cameras for a group photo before I close this session, the opening.
Take picture from your side.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm done. Okay.
Done. Thank you very much.
Again, I would like now moving to the second part. Of this virtual event, going through detailed academy agenda and going through the detailed academy agenda and the topics to be discussed during the 4th cycle, and finalizing with ice-breaking between participants session, which will be led by my colleague Mu'tasam. The link of this session already provided via the WhatsApp group for all those who have registered with us in this academy. Again, I would like to thank each one of you on behalf of AKEA, of the Arab Campaign for Education for All, for accepting our invitation and being part of this webinar, this official launching event. Finally, I would like to thank all the speakers for their excellent thought-talking points and keeping things both under control and reasonably on time. The Arab Campaign for Education for All is honored to welcome you all attendees, members, and partner institutions who are with us today in the launch of the fourth cycle of the Arab Educational Policies Academy on the analysis of public budgets for education this evening. It's been a pleasure being with all of you today. Thank you. It's been really a pleasure and we are glad to have you all here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you.
طيب شكرا هبة. بتمنى من الجميع نسخ الرابط اللي أرسلته قبل القليل على صندوق الشات. راح أغلق الاجتماع الحالي وأفتح الاجتماع القادم والجميع يدخلوا. راح أودي برضو الرابط على مجموعة الواتساب الخاصة بالأكاديمية. شكرا، يعطيكم العافية جميعا.